Do you want to accomplish your goals? Do you want to strengthen your relationships? Do you want to have success that you could have never imagined to be possible? What's stopping you? Fear. Fear is stopping you, and more specifically, the fear of being vulnerable. Today, I will teach you how to transform your life by finding the courage to be vulnerable. I truly believe that the advice I'm about to give you can transform your life. And I'm not an expert in being vulnerable. I'm still scared to bring up certain conversation topics with certain people. I'm still scared to meet people for the first time. And I'm still scared to ask questions that might lead to some resistance. But I know that I push myself because I know that that sort of vulnerability can change my life for the better. Hi, I'm Michael and welcome back to my channel. This video on vulnerability is inspired by Brené Brown's book, Daring Greatly. There are so many definitions of vulnerability. So I want to clarify that when I say vulnerability, I mean that vulnerability is the courage to put yourself out there. The courage to be open to the world, despite knowing the fact that the world may hurt us. Being vulnerable is not something that's weak. Being vulnerable is something that's strong and brave, courageous even. So why be vulnerable? Vulnerability allows us to experience joy, belonging, and love, emotions and experiences that we all crave and desire. We all want others to be vulnerable, but we resist being vulnerable ourselves because putting ourselves out in the world can lead to negative consequences. So we stop ourselves. So in a general sense, we understand why we don't want to be vulnerable innately, but there are more specific categories or reasoning behind why we don't want to be vulnerable. First, we see today's culture of never enough. We have a culture today of never being enough, never being successful enough, never being good enough, never being smart enough. It all negatively affects us and our chances of being vulnerable. The culture of never being enough is upheld by shame. Shame being identifying somebody as a bad person rather than identifying their actions as bad actions. For example, shame is saying that someone is bad. The better alternative is guilt, when saying that somebody's actions are bad. When we learn to use guilt instead of shame, we can bring down this negative culture and encourage vulnerability within ourselves and with others. Besides replacing shame with guilt, we have to all understand that we are worthy and that we are enough in this culture of never being enough. That is what allows us to be vulnerable. And although being vulnerable can hurt us, it can lead to such great benefits mentally and emotionally. And there are a few myths that are important to clear up about vulnerability. Many people see vulnerability as weakness, but inherently by the definition of vulnerability, it is the courage to put yourself out there, having the bravery to be open to the world, despite the fact that the world can hurt you in return. By definition, vulnerability is being the truth. It's being brave, it's being courageous. So vulnerability is not weakness, it's strength. Some people hold the notion that they don't do vulnerability. And in high school, I was similar because I was very closed off. I didn't want to be exposed or be vulnerable to the world. It was safe to not be vulnerable, so I didn't want to open myself out there to the world. But the fact is that vulnerability is the base of our emotions, and it's simply silly to put ourselves away from it because then we can't form deep relationships with others. Some people think that vulnerability is letting it all hang out, but vulnerability is not oversharing. You have to gain the trust of people you're going to be vulnerable with, and you have to trust the people you're going to be vulnerable with in return. There's a good analogy described of a marble jar. If somebody does something that shows you that you can trust them, you add a marble to their jar. And if somebody does something that hurts your trust of them, you remove a marble, or multiple marbles if it's a serious offense. So if somebody has no marbles in your jar, you obviously wouldn't share something very personal about your life or some very emotional story about your life with them. As somebody gains your trust over time, that is when you can be more vulnerable with them. And inherently, we as humans know this because we're not going to start oversharing different stuff about our lives with strangers on the street. People need to gain your trust in order for you to be vulnerable with them. The final myth is that we as humans go at it alone. Although independence is important, we are biologically social, so it is important to have support from other people, such as family and friends, to go through difficult life events. And besides that, asking people for help leads to the greatest transformations in our lives. Being able to ask for help is being vulnerable. In other words, vulnerability is about asking for help. So many times we're so able to give advice to other people, but in how many cases are we able to step out of our comfort zone and ask others for help? We want to maintain the facade that we understand everything and that we understand everything that we are doing in life. So being vulnerable is about asking for help when you know that you're uncertain about something and that it will be more helpful for you to gain the advice of another person. So no, we don't go at it alone. So how do you use this knowledge to transform your life? We can use vulnerability to transform our own lives, our relationships with our friends, friends, our schools and organizations, and our family. We can transform ourselves by understanding the defense mechanisms we have against vulnerability. All of us have some sort of armor that we put against vulnerability. The first armor is foreboding joy. In other words, we maintain a state of depression and sadness out of a fear that if we are joyful, we're going to be put in a state of sadness again by an event that ultimately comes up in our lives. And of course, there are tragic incidents in our lives, the passing of a loved one, or some sort of failure on our part. But it's important to maintain a sense of gratitude in order to prevent this armor from protecting us from our vulnerability. Being grateful is being vulnerable. So an exercise that I find helpful is to write down 5 things you're grateful for every morning, just to make sure that you train yourself to develop a sense of gratitude. If you're not grateful for the things in your life, you're going to maintain a sense of sadness out of the fear that something sad is going to happen to you anyway, so you might as well stay in that state so you're not disappointed. But if you're sad all the time, you're not going to get to experience the highs of being happy and grateful for your life. So it's important to stop yourself from staying in this solemn state and be grateful for what you have in life. Another armor we put on is perfectionism, which is an attempt to avoid shame by avoiding the mistakes and the shame associated with mistakes in general. In order to prevent perfectionism and to stop ourselves from trying to be a perfectionist, we have to understand that we are worthy and enough no matter what mistakes we make. And every human makes mistakes. In fact, psychologically, people like other people's rough edges. So even making a mistake when you don't mean to shows people your human side and makes you more charismatic and a more likable character. Another armor we have to vulnerability is numbing. We numb ourselves to deep emotions because we don't want to deal with the experiences of them. We go and participate in certain questionable habits to prevent ourselves from experiencing deep emotions, and it's simply not the right action to take in. The solution to numbing is to allow ourselves to feel the deep emotions that are necessary to deal with in our life. In the long term, we're going to have to experience these one time and again. So it's important to allow ourselves to learn how to deal with these emotions and not allow ourselves to prevent ourselves to experience these emotions by participating in bad habits. Another armor is criticism, our attempt to be heard. In terms of critiquing other people, especially online, a good exercise is to ask yourself if you would be comfortable with putting your name next to anything that you post. If you aren't, it's an indicator that you shouldn't post that criticism. Be sure to take responsibility for whatever you say, especially online, and you'll stop yourself from critiquing somebody in a negative or harmful manner, and critique them in a more constructive way. We've all been in a situation where we try to dodge an email or a phone call or some sort of conversation with somebody because we don't want to deal with the fear or the negative backlash that might occur with something, or we don't want to deal with the negative emotions that are associated with an event. In fact, that's one of the bases of procrastination. So how do we prevent this? And what is it called? A name that you can put on this is serpentining, or avoiding vulnerability by serpentining around it. And the key solution to prevent serpentining is to simply reality check yourself. If you're in a very stressful situation, take a moment to breathe and understand that everything is going to be alright in the long run. You have to deal with difficult situations in your life. So you have to learn to take action. If you're going to see success, you're going to have to learn to prevent yourself from letting fear stop you. In fact, some psychologists recommend to use that trigger of fear trying to block you to catalyze yourself to go through with an action. So if you're feeling some sort of fear or anxiety thinking about something, use that to go and do that thing that you're scared of doing. In the long run, it's going to make your life a lot better. So all of those different vulnerability armors are necessary to identify, and I'm sure there's at least one you've identified in yourself. The struggle comes in learning to take off that armor and allow yourself to be vulnerable, because in the long run, it's important to allow ourselves to experience those emotions and to stop fear from preventing us from doing the things that we want to do in life. So now that we understand how vulnerability can change our own lives, how do we improve the lives of our friendships and our relationships? The answer is sort of intuitive, because vulnerability is in fact the key to friendships. Research being done on friendships shows that people who refuse to be vulnerable with their friends eventually revert to a state of small talk, and small talk inherently killed the friendship. So if you want to be scared into vulnerability, that's one key way to do it. But on the bright side, being vulnerable allows for deeper friendships, and two people who allow themselves to be vulnerable more quickly allow themselves to become friends more quickly, as shown by research. So one tip I have to be more vulnerable with friends is to tell them about a major life event immediately after it's happened. If you experience the unfortunate passing of a loved one, for example, it's important to tell somebody you trust that you're going through a difficult time, because if you don't share that negative news with somebody else, you're going to suffer much more. Your friends and your family act as a support system, so it's important to tell important events in your life to them immediately when they happen. And it's important to encourage your friends to tell you the same as well, because we can inherently lessen the burden that deep emotional events put on us and allow ourselves to heal from these emotional events more effectively. In any school or organization, we've always had the opportunity to give feedback to other people, especially as a mentor to some individual. So it's important to understand one of the best ways to give feedback to people, and that key ingredient is vulnerability. We all know the sandwich method of trying to give somebody some sort of critique. You say something positive, then negative, then positive again, in order to sort of hide the critique. But addressing the critique more directly with the help of vulnerability makes it more likely that the person will be able to advance themselves while also taking your criticism more directly and personally without taking offense. So how do you use vulnerability to critique somebody? You start by acknowledging their strengths, or acknowledge at least 3 strengths from their work or what they did. After you acknowledge 3 strengths, you address the situation or some of the critiques you have on their work or their performance. And then after you address that critique, you show yourself to be vulnerable and allow yourself to provide support to them. For example, there was a professor who didn't like the reference section of a student's very thorough and detailed paper. So when she addressed that situation with the student, she acknowledged that the paper was very well written and that the paper was very eloquent, but that the student could work on her references. The key with vulnerability in this case was that the professor told the student that she also had trouble formatting her references when she was younger, and that she'd always be open to help the student in terms of learning how to correctly format these references. This inherently made the student more open to her critique and allowed the student to develop her writing more effectively, rather than the teacher simply saying that her references were incorrect and deducting points from a grading scale. If you want to be a leader, you have to be vulnerable, because you won't be able to change people for the better if you're not vulnerable with yourself and with them. Families are perhaps one of the most important environments for vulnerability. And just the key tip here is that our actions speak much louder than our words. We have to be role models in our families so that our siblings, our children, our relatives are able to follow us and our example in our vulnerability. For example, we all know the situation of a parent yelling at their child for misbehaving, but ancient traditions in ancient cultures such as the Inuit show that these parents do not yell at their children. A successful strategy passed down from hundreds of years of working with children in the Inuit show that adults never yell at their children, or rarely yell at their children, because yelling shows a lack of emotional maturity. Rather, they simply do not give mind to the children's fits or tantrums and simply address the children directly at a more vulnerable and personal level. Addressing them in a more calm and silenced tone rather than yelling at the child will allow them to develop a deeper connection and will allow the child to listen more closely to them. Paying no mind to the child's bad behavior or tantrums will teach the child to not behave in such a way. By simply maintaining emotional strength and being vulnerable with their children, the Inuit parents inherently are raising their children to also have emotional strength and to not yell when the situation gets to a dire point. As a bonus tip, ignore the people in the stands. In other words, if you wouldn't take advice from somebody, don't take their critiques or criticisms. You have to value your own self-perception more than the perception others have of you. Again, you value your own self-perception more than the perception others have of you. If you only value your own self-perception, you're a narcissist. But if you only value the perception of others around you, you're a needy individual. You have to have a balance. And of course, the people who you trust and respect, your family, your friends, those people are looking out for you and trying to help you live a better life. So it's of course important to value other people's perceptions of you. But it's important, of course, to have your own self-worth and self-confidence and to put that above anything else. So stop caring about the judgment of people who are not your friends and you don't care about. But make sure to keep those who are close to you in mind, because they are the ones who care about you. So have the courage to be vulnerable. Have the courage to dare greatly, because you are worthy and you are enough. Thanks for watching. I hope that this video was helpful. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.